The ICU doors didn't just open, they exploded inward, steel frame shrieking against the floor, and the man on the gurney was already the wrong color. Gray-blue, not pale. Gray-blue, the kind of color that meant the window was already closing. 3 paramedics were shouting over each other. One of them had blood up to his elbow, and every physician in the corridor took one look at the incoming trauma and physically stepped backward. Every physician except one. She wasn't even supposed to be on shift. She'd clocked 16 hours. Her scrubs had someone else's coffee on the left sleeve, and she stepped forward before the gurney had fully cleared, the threshold gloved hands already moving. Eyes reading the wound before anyone else had processed what they were seeing. Someone in the back of the crowd said, quietly, "Who is that?" And the charge nurse who'd worked Hartwell Memorial for 11 years watched the woman work and felt something cold move through her. Because she'd seen good nurses. She'd seen great ones. She had never seen anything like this. Before we go any further, if you found this channel, you already know we don't do ordinary stories here. We do the ones that get under your skin and stay there. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens to this woman over the next 5 parts is going to make you furious, then stunned, then, I promise you, deeply satisfied. Tap the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every comment tells me someone out there was watching. Don't go anywhere. Her name was Sarah Mullen, and at Hartwell Memorial Hospital in Calverton, Ohio, she was considered furniture, not incompetent. Nobody could say that to her face and make it stick because her patient outcomes were better than 3 of the floor's attending physicians, and everyone who looked at the numbers knew it. But numbers at Hartwell Memorial didn't translate into respect. They translated into more assignments, heavier caseloads, and the quiet institutional assumption that Sarah Mullen would always be there to absorb whatever the shift threw at her without complaint. She was the person charge nurses called when they needed something done and didn't want to argue about how. She was the person attendings paged when a patient deteriorated at 2 in the morning and the situation required someone calm. She was, in the language that hospitals used without ever saying out loud, reliable, which at Hartwell meant exploitable, which meant invisible. She had worked the ICU for 4 years. She had requested twice to be considered for the Advanced Trauma Response Team. Both requests had been declined by the same man, Dr. Garrett Ashby, Chief of Surgical Services, a man who wore his confidence, the way other men wore cologne, applied heavily, reapplied often, impossible to ignore in an enclosed space. He was not a bad surgeon. That was the thing that made him difficult to argue against. He was genuinely skilled, had a wall of credentials that meant something, and had the kind of institutional memory that came from 22 years at the same hospital. He knew where every body was buried, politically speaking. He knew which administrators owed him favors and which board members remembered which donations he'd helped secure. He was the type of man who had never needed to be wrong because he had always arranged his environment so that he was never visibly wrong. The residents around him adjusted. The nurses around him learned to absorb. The system around him bent in the direction he needed it to bend, not because anyone particularly wanted to give him that power, but because nobody wanted to spend the energy it would take to push back. Sarah Mullen disturbed that arrangement. She couldn't help it. It wasn't strategic on her part. She wasn't maneuvering against him. She simply knew things he didn't, made calls he wouldn't, and occasionally saved patients that his protocols would have lost. The first time it happened, 18 months into her tenure at Hartwell, he'd called it luck. The second time, he called it a violation of scope. The third time, he called her into his office and told her, with the particular calm of a man who never raised his voice because he'd never needed to, that she needed to remember her role. "You're a nurse," he said. "A good one, I'm told. But there's a ceiling here for a reason, and it protects everyone. including the patients. She had sat across from him in that chair brown leather, deliberately lower than his own, and nodded. Said she understood. She understood perfectly. She just didn't agree. What Ashby didn't know, what nobody at Hartwell Memorial knew because she had never volunteered it and nobody had ever thought to ask, was that Sarah Mullen had spent 6 years in a different kind of medical environment entirely. Not a residency, not an academic program. She had been a special operations combat medic attached to a joint task force operating in conditions that made any civilian trauma bay look orderly by comparison. She had kept people alive in the dirt, in the dark, in situations where the textbook answer was 300 miles away and irrelevant. She had made decisions that no protocol covered because the protocol assumed you had a hospital behind you, a full team, clean instruments, reliable power, time to consult. She had never had any of those things reliably. What she'd had was training sharp enough to compensate, instincts built from repetition under pressure, and the knowledge that hesitation in her environment wasn't a character flaw as a cause of death. She had come home, quietly, enrolled in nursing school on the GI Bill, got her credentials, got a job, and decided that what she wanted was to help people without anyone shooting at her. Reasonable ambition. She didn't talk about the service. She didn't display anything. She kept a single photograph in her apartment, not framed, not mounted, just sitting in the drawer of the bedside table. And she looked at it sometimes, and then put it back. She had a roommate who didn't know. She had worked alongside colleagues for 4 years who didn't know. She had made her peace with not being known, with existing at Hartwell as simply Sarah Mullen, ICU nurse, reliable, invisible, furniture. The problem with that piece was that it required everyone else to stay in their lane, too. The Tuesday morning that everything changed started like most of Sarah's Tuesdays badly. She arrived 12 minutes early, which at Hartwell was already considered aggressive behavior by the overnight nursing staff who resented the implication that arriving on time meant they'd been slacking. The charge nurse, Donna Pruitt, handed her a tablet with the shift assignments and said, without looking up, Ashby wants you on bay 4 through 7. Heavy load today. Don't make it a thing. Did I ever make it a thing? You have a face, Donna said. Your face makes things. Sarah took the tablet and looked at these assignments. Bay 4 through 7 was 4 critical patients, 2 of whom were post-surgical, 1 of whom was on a ventilator, and 1 of whom had a notation in the chart that his family was coming in at 10 to discuss transition of care. That last one meant paperwork, emotional weight, and the particular careful language of end-of-life conversations, all of which would happen while she was also monitoring the other 3, and responding to whatever else the morning decided to throw at her. She didn't argue. She went to work. The ICU at 7 in the morning had its own specific quality of light fluorescent and relentless, no concession to the hour, the same brightness at dawn as at midnight. Sauced, Sarah? Sarah moved through it without thinking about it, the way you stop noticing things that had always been there. She checked lines, reviewed overnight notes, cross-referenced medication logs against the orders in the system, looking for the kind of small discrepancies that accumulated quietly until they became emergencies. This was the part of nursing that nobody outside nursing understood the amount of it. That was detective work, pattern recognition, the skill of reading a chart the way a mechanic read an engine, listening for what wasn't supposed to be there. She found something at 7:45. The post-surgical patient in Bay 5 was a woman named Patricia Holt, 63 years old. 2 days out from a bowel resection that had gone well, technically, but was showing the kind of metabolic drift, but was showing that post-operative patients developed when monitoring was good, but follow-through was incomplete. Her potassium levels were trending in a direction Sarah didn't like. Not critical yet, not the kind of number that would set off alarms or get anyone paged automatically. But moving. Moving in the direction that, If it continued for another 8 hours without correction, would become a very different conversation. The overnight resident had adjusted her diuretics without updating the electrolyte replacement protocol. It was the kind of gap that happened, not negligence, exactly. More the product of too many patients and too little sleep. A small administrative failure that fell into space between two people's responsibilities and waited there. Sarah flagged it, paged the resident on call, got no response. Paged again, got a call back from a third year named Dr. Elliot Marsh, who sounded like he'd been asleep, which he probably had been, because third years doing overnight call were always either asleep or wishing they were. I'll adjust the replacement when I do rounds, he said. Her levels are already trending. If they drop another, I'll do rounds in an hour, Nurse Mullen. She looked at the chart. She looked at Patricia Holt, who was sleeping, who had no idea that the gap between her current trajectory and a cardiac event was narrower than it should be. Then Sarah went to the medication room, pulled the potassium supplement that fell within her nursing scope of practice, and administered it with documentation that was so meticulous it would have survived any audit Ashby had ever ordered. 40 minutes later, Marsh showed up, reviewed the chart, and said nothing. The levels had corrected. There was nothing to say. He signed off and moved on, and Sarah, with the particular feeling of someone who had just quietly caught a ball that someone else dropped and was waiting to see if anyone's noticed. Someone noticed. At 9:15, Ashby came through on his morning walkthrough, a daily ritual that he conducted with the specific energy of a general reviewing troops. Not because he needed to, but because being seen doing it was part of how he maintained his position. He stopped at Bay 5, reviewed the chart, and looked at Sarah with the expression she'd come to recognize as the preamble to a documented complaint. You administered a potassium supplement. Within nursing scope, patients' levels were trending, and the replacement protocol hadn't been updated after the diuretic adjustment. Paged Marsh. He said he'd handle it at rounds. An hour was too long given her trajectory, and you decided your clinical judgment superseded his. Sarah held her voice even. She had practice at this. I decided Patricia Holt's electrolyte balance was more important than waiting for a schedule to catch up with her physiology. Ashby looked at her for a long moment with those pale gray eyes that gave nothing away. We'll discuss this later, he said, and moved on. That was how it always went. Not a confrontation, not a direct reprimand in the moment. Just a deferral, a logged note, the slow accumulation of grievances that Ashby was collecting with the patience of someone who understood institutional timelines better than anyone else in the building. Sarah had been around enough large organizations, military and civilian, both to understand exactly what that pattern meant. He was building a file. He had the temperament for it and the position to make it matter. She went back to work. By 11 that morning, the charge desk had received a preliminary alert from the County Emergency Coordination Office. There had been a structural failure on the westbound span of the Route 9 overpass 6 miles east of the hospital during midday traffic. Early reports were fragmentary. First responders were on scene. Field teams were describing multiple vehicle involvement, significant casualties, and structural debris that was complicating extraction. Calverton Regional Medical Center was designated primary receiving. That designation lasted 40 minutes before Calverton Regional called to report they had hit capacity and were diverting all incoming trauma. Then Hartwell Memorial was primary. The change in the building's atmosphere was immediate and physical, the kind of shift that people who work in hospitals learn to feel before they can name it. A change in velocity, in the specific quality of noise from the nurse's station, in the way people moved through corridors. Sarah felt it on the ICU floor and knew what it meant before anyone came upstairs to confirm it. Donna appeared at the unit entrance. Mass casualty activation, she said. Overpass collapse. Unknown number of critical inbounds. How's the ER staffed? Not for this. Donna's expression was not panic. She had too much experience for panic, but it was close to something. He's running point downstairs. He's pulling everyone he can. Sarah looked at her 4 ICU patients through the glass panels of their bays. 2 post-surgical, 1 vent-dependent, 1 transitioning to comfort care, with family arriving in less than an hour. Could not abandon them. But she could feel the hospital reorganizing around her, resources shifting, the careful architecture of a normal shift dissolving into something that would require every available person to hold whatever piece of it they could reach. Get me float coverage for Bay 6 and 7 if they open more ICU beds, she told Donna. And tell whoever's managing ER intake that if critical patients need ICU-level triage before there's a bed, I can consult from up here. Donna looked at her. Then she nodded and went. The first ambulances arrived at 11:47. Hartwell's trauma intake was not designed for mass casualty events. It had 2 designated trauma bays, a third that could be converted with effort, and an emergency department layout that prioritized controlled, sequential intake over the kind of volume that was now coming through its doors. The overpass had failed during peak midday traffic. 14 vehicles had been directly involved in the initial collapse. By the time the first wave hit Hartwell's emergency department, field medics at the scene were reporting a situation that the county had not seen in 2 decades. Sarah managed her floor. She had 4 patients, and then a 5th added from the ER overflow. She checked lines and monitors and ventilator settings. She sat with Patricia Holt's daughter for 11 minutes when the woman arrived early and was too shaken by what she'd seen in the parking lot, the ambulances, the gurneys, the organized chaos of a hospital in emergency activation to wait calmly in the family room. Sarah got her water, answered her questions about her mother, honestly and without clinical distance, and sent her to the family room with the clear and specific promise that she would come back. Came back 22 minutes later, as promised. 12:20, she got a second float nurse assigned to her floor as 2 more ICU beds were open for overflow from the ER. She got them oriented in 4 minutes. She checked Bay 4, where her vent patient had developed a minor alarm that turned out to be a sensor issue and not a patient issue, which was the best possible outcome, but still required 15 minutes to confirm. At 12:35, Ashby walked onto the ICU floor. She knew immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong with the hospital, broadly, that was already established, but wrong specifically, a problem he couldn't solve with what he had downstairs. His walk-through posture was gone. His face had lost the manufactured evenness that he maintained like armor. He looked, for the first time in 4 years of working near him, like a person trying to figure out what to do next instead of a person who had already decided. Stopped in front of her. "Trauma Bay 2, he said. "Airway compromise. RSI isn't holding. Marsh attempted positioning twice. The anatomy is significantly compromised, blunt force laryngeal injury, severe edema, and we're losing ground on the SAT." Sarah set down the chart she was holding. "Get Ramirez from surgery." "Ramirez is in an open chest in OR 1. He's not available." Ashby paused. Pause was its own communication. "I need someone who has managed a compromised surgical airway outside of controlled OR conditions." The ICU was quiet around them in the way that spaces get quiet when something significant is happening. The float nurse at the station had stopped typing. Donna, who had appeared at some point, was very still near the door. Sarah looked at him. "You know my scope," she said. "I know what your scope says on paper." He held her gaze, and she could see the cost of what he was about to say, a man who had spent 22 years building a particular version of himself, now having to step outside it. "I'm asking what you can actually do, not what the paper says. What you can do." It was the first time in 4 years he had asked her anything like that. Pulled off her gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. Grabbed fresh ones. Turned to the float nurse. Eyes on Bay 5 and 6. "Potassium's in 5 is stable, but watch the trend. If anything moves, Page me immediately. The float nurse nodded. Sarah followed Ashby to the elevator without another word. Trauma Bay 2 was louder than a trauma bay should be, which meant things were not under control in the way that mattered. 2 nurses, 1 third-year resident, and a respiratory therapist named Marcus Webb were managing a patient who was fighting for oxygen through an airway that was closing around him. The man on the table was in his mid-40s, construction worker. By the look of the work clothes, they hadn't fully cut away yet. Face already deep with bruising that spoke to the kind of impact force that didn't come from a vehicle collision. Alone been hit by something structural, something with weight and velocity, and his neck had taken the consequence of it. Sarah crossed to the bedside and looked at him before she looked at anything else. She had learned early that you started with the patient and let the equipment be secondary. Chart, said David Kohler, 44. The patient said, someone who was still fighting, whose body was still trying to compensate, but who was running out of margin. Sat, she said to Webb, 81 and dropping. Was holding at 87 until about 7 minutes ago. She looked at the tube placement, looked at the swelling pattern on his neck, the specific geography of the edema, where it was densest, how it was distorting the anatomy that the tube placement had to navigate. Marsh was at the foot of the bed, and she could feel his discomfort without looking at him, the particular discomfort of someone who had tried twice and failed, and was now watching someone else assess what they'd done. The edema's progressed since placement, she said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just true. The tubes being partially occluded at the level of the injury. You can't correct it from the same approach the swellings changed the geometry. We could try a different blade, Marsh said. You could, Sarah said. And you'd be attempting blind positioning through tissue that's closed off 2 access angles in the last 10 minutes. That's not a better option. She looked at Webb. Crick kit. The room absorbed that. Marsh said carefully. She doesn't have. Dr. Marsh. Ashby's voice from inside the door was very quiet. The kind of quiet that was louder than shouting. Get the kit or step out. Marsh got the kit. Sarah had performed the procedure twice before in her life, not in a hospital, not in a trauma bay with clean instruments and proper lighting, and a full team standing around her. Once on a dirt floor with a headlamp, once in the back of a moving vehicle. Both times, the margin between success and the alternative was narrow enough that she'd had to choose not to think about it until it was over. This was easier than both of those times. She had light. She had a proper kit. She had Marcus Webb, who turned out to be precise and quick, and who anticipated what she needed without being told, which told her something about his experience. She talked to David Kohler while she worked, not because he could hear her clearly through the sedation, but because she believed in the way that experience, rather than theory-produced belief, that it mattered. That the sound of a calm voice doing something purposeful was better than silence, even when the person couldn't respond. She made the incision, found the membrane. The anatomy was distorted but present. She placed the tube. Webb secured it. The SAT monitor showed 77 at the moment of placement. Then 78. Then the climb began. 83. 88. 92. 95. Webb exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath, and said, good placement. Watch the edema progression, Sarah said. She was already stripping the gloves. If the swelling continues to advance, we need imaging the surface presentation. May not be showing the full extent of the injury. There could be deeper structural involvement. She looked at Marsh, who was staring at her with an expression that had moved through several phases and arrived at something complicated. You made the right call getting the kit when I asked, she said, because he had. And because the people who got credit for what they did right were more likely to learn from what they did wrong than the ones who only heard about their failures. She turned toward the door. Ashby stepped aside to let her pass, and she felt his eyes on her back as she went through it, and she didn't turn around. She got back to the ICU at 12:50 and found that the float coverage had missed a ventilator alarm on Bay 4 that had been silenced without documentation, which was exactly the kind of gap she'd been worried about. She spent 17 minutes reconstructing the timeline, confirming the patient was stable, documenting what had happened, and having a quiet, direct conversation with the float nurse about the difference between silencing an alarm and clearing it. Not a reprimand, a correction. There was a difference, and she tried to maintain it. Patricia Holt's daughter was still in the family room. Sarah went back, sat with her, answered more questions, helped her understand what the comfort care process meant in practical terms, not in the careful euphemistic language that institutions use to protect themselves, but in the plain language that someone deserved someone when they were trying to understand what was going to happen to their mother. At 1:40, she got a page from Ashby's extension. Called back between Bay checks. "Collar's stable," he said. "OR team has his imaging. The injury was more extensive than the surface presentation, as you said. They're taking him up in 20 minutes. Okay." A pause. Long enough to be deliberate. "You've done that before," he said. It wasn't a question. Not in a training scenario. "You've done that before in a real situation." "I have training," Sarah said. "That's not an answer." She looked through the glass at Bay 4. Her vent patient's waveform was clean. Outside, the afternoon sky was gray and flat, and the parking lot below was still full of emergency vehicles that hadn't left yet. And somewhere in the city, the remains of a collapsed overpass were still being cleared. And David Collar was going to be alive tomorrow because of a window of 6 minutes and a decision made in a room where she technically had no authority to make it. "I have to get back to my patients, Dr. Ashby," she said. She hung up. The rest of the afternoon moved with the grinding quality of a long shift that had already given everything it had and was being asked for more. More trauma came through the ER, though the volume had decreased as the scene stabilized. Sarah worked through it without stopping, without eating anything beyond half a granola bar at 2:30 over a medication cart, without thinking beyond the next task and then the next one after that. At 3:50, she completed documentation on all 6 of her patients. At 4:10, she briefed the incoming shift nurse on Patricia Holt's family situation, the vent patient's alarm history, and the 2 overflow admissions who'd arrived after noon. She did it methodically. Nothing skipped, the kind of handoff that prevented things from falling through cracks overnight. At 4:15, Donna Pruitt appeared at the ICU entrance. Her expression was different from anything Sarah had seen on her in 4 years of working together. Not alarm exactly. Something more uncertain than alarm, more careful. Donna Pruitt was a woman who had seen most things and responded to all of them with the same competent steadiness. Whatever she was looking at now, she wasn't sure what category it belonged to. "You need to come with me," she said. "I'm mid-handoff. Lorraine can finish the handoff. Ashby wants you in the admin wing." She paused. "There are people here. What kind of people?" Donna looked at her for a long moment. Then they came in a vehicle with federal plates. They didn't sign in at the front desk security, just waved them through, which has never happened in the 11 years I've worked here. They went directly to the admin wing, and when I asked one of them what this was about, he told me they were here for a nurse. Another pause. He gave them a name I have never heard anyone in this building use. The shift around Sarah continued to monitor, beeping somewhere down the corridor. Someone calling for assistance from Bay 6, the constant low hum of a hospital that didn't stop for anything. She stood in it and felt the specific weight of a thing she had been outrunning for 4 years, catching up to her at a pace she had always known it eventually would. "What name?" she said. Donna told her. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached up and straightened her badge, a small, automatic gesture. The kind of thing a person did when they needed 1 second of occupation for their hands, while their mind settled into a decision. Tell Ashby I'll be there in 5 minutes, she said. Her voice was even. And make sure whoever came in that vehicle is still in the room when I get there. All of them. She went back to Bay 5, checked Patricia Holt's levels one final time, said goodnight to the woman, who was awake now and watching the ceiling with the patient endurance of someone who had learned to wait. Then she walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the administrative floor, and stood in the rising car with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. The doors opened. At the end of the corridor, through the glass panel of the admin conference room, she could see 4 figures. One of them was Ashby, standing in a posture she had never seen on him, not dominant, not in control, but something closer to uncertain. The body language of a man who had just been told something that rearranged his understanding of a situation he thought he had fully mapped. The other 3 wore civilian clothes, but they stood the way that people who had spent years in a specific kind of environment always stood, weight distributed, aware of every exit, comfortable with stillness in a way that most people weren't. One of them had his back to the corridor. When Sarah's footsteps reached a certain distance, he turned around before she had made any sound she was aware of. He looked at her. She looked at him. The elevator behind her closed. Corridor was quiet, and somewhere in the building below, David Kohler was breathing through an airway that she had made for him, and Patricia Holt's potassium levels were stable, and the hospital was still moving. Indifferent and continuous around the specific weight of this moment. She kept walking. She pushed open the conference room door without knocking. It wasn't defiance. It was the habit of someone who had spent years entering rooms where hesitation at the threshold communicated the wrong thing, where the first 2 seconds told everyone present whether you were going to be useful or a problem. Pushed it open, walked in, and let the door swing shut behind her without looking back at it. There were 4 people in the room. Ashby stood near the window with his arms crossed, which for him was a posture of containment rather than aggression, the body language of a man processing something he hadn't finished processing yet. To his left, a hospital administrator named Carol Spence sat at the conference table with a legal pad in front of her that had nothing written on it, which meant she'd been present for less than 10 minutes and hadn't figured out what to write down yet. The other 3 were the ones who mattered. They were positioned without appearing to be positioned too near the table, one by the far wall, all a triangular arrangement that looked casual until you understood that it wasn't. The one who had turned in the corridor when he heard her coming was standing closest to her now. He was in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from sustained physical conditioning rather than the gym variety, with a face that had more mileage than his age would suggest. He wore dark civilian clothes and no insignia of any kind, but he carried himself with the specific economy of someone who had spent a long time in environments where every movement cost something. He said her name, not Sarah Mullen, the other one. The operational name that she hadn't heard spoken aloud since the day she signed her separation papers and drove out of a base in the dark with everything she owned in the back seat of a car she'd bought for $3,000 cash. She looked at him for 1 full second. Then, Holloway. "Good to see you," Master Chief Ryan Holloway said. "I don't know that it is yet." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Not because she needed to sit, but because sitting told everyone in the room that she wasn't going anywhere and wasn't going to be managed. "How did you find this hospital? We've known where you were for 2 years. "Then why now?" Holloway glanced at the man by the wall, brief, communicative, and the man by the wall gave a small nod. Then Holloway reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a folder on the table. Not thick, 6 or 8 pages. He pushed it across to her without opening it. "We have a situation," he said. "You always have a situation. This one involves you specifically, not your skills. You." He tapped the folder. "There's a man named Darius Volk. He was extracted from a border region 14 months ago by a joint team. During the extraction, He sustained injuries that your unit treated in the field. You treated. Sarah looked at the folder and didn't touch it. I remember Volk. He's currently in federal medical custody in a facility outside Pittsburgh. He's been a medically induced coma for 6 weeks because the treating team at the facility can't stabilize a complication that developed from the original field injury. The tissue damage at the injury site has been progressing. 3 separate surgical consults have reviewed his case, and all 3 have said the same thing. Holloway paused. That whoever performed the original field treatment left a marker, a specific technique that was used to manage the injury in conditions that shouldn't have allowed for that level of precision. And that whoever did it is the only one who fully understands the anatomy of what was done, because no one is entirely sure how it was done. The room was quiet. Ashby by the window had uncrossed his arms. He was listening with the particular quality of attention that men with large egos gave to him, recalibrated their understanding of his situation, visible, effortful, slightly uncomfortable. "You need me to consult on a federal patient," Sarah said. "We need you to come to Pittsburgh. The facility's medical team needs to understand what was done in the field before they can determine how to manage the progression. Every week he stays in the coma, the risk of permanent neurological damage increases." Holloway's voice had stayed even throughout, but there was something underneath it, not urgency exactly, something more weathered than that. He has information that 3 governments need access to. His medical team can't act without understanding the original injury. And the only person who understands the original injury is sitting across from me. Carol Spence, who had been silent, said carefully, "This would require a leave of absence from the hospital." "There are protocols, the hospital's protocols," Holloway said, without looking at her, "are not the primary concern." "They're a concern," Sarah said. Holloway looked at her. "I know. I have patients here. I have a woman in Bay 5 who's 2 days post-surgical and whose care is in a critical monitoring window. I have a vent patient whose alarm history over the last 8 hours has not been properly documented. I cannot walk out of this building tonight. We're not asking for tonight. How long, we don't know exactly. Minimum 3 days for the consultation. Possibly a week if the surgical team needs ongoing guidance." Sarah looked at the folder. Then she picked it up and opened it. First page was a medical summary, dense, technical, the kind of document written by someone who knew what they were writing about. She read it in the way she read everything. Medical, quickly, and without skipping the way that people read when reading was actually analysis rather than information intake. Turned the second page. Read, turned the third. Closed the folder. She looked at Holloway and said, "The complication is at the lateral margin of the original repair. The surgical team believes." It's not a belief. "The approach I used in the field displaced the tissue in a specific direction because the alternative would have severed a nerve cluster that was already compromised. The treating team at the facility has been managing the complication without understanding that displacement. They've probably been applying pressure in exactly the wrong direction." She set the folder back on the table, which means they've been making it worse. Holloway was very still. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I want to see his current imaging before I say anything else." Ashby spoke for the first time since she'd entered the room. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, not deference. Not quite, but something adjacent to it, the sound of a man choosing words with more care than usual. "What exactly is your background?" Nurse Mullen. She looked at him. "It's in my HR file, Dr. Ashby. It says you served in the military. It says medic classification. It doesn't say," he gestured slightly toward the 3 men in civilian clothes. "It doesn't say anything that explains this." "No," she said. "Doesn't. Should it have?" She considered him for a moment. Not the question was straightforward, but the man asking it, who had spent 4 years building a file on her for procedural overreach and was now standing in a room with 3 federal agents who had crossed 2 state lines to ask for her specific expertise. She thought about what it cost him to be in that room right now and decided, not out of generosity but out of accuracy, that it was considerable. Probably, she said, but it wouldn't have changed anything. He didn't answer that. He looked out the window instead. Conversation with Holloway lasted another 40 minutes. 2 other men, he introduced them as Webb and Carver. First names only. No elaboration, said almost nothing throughout, which told Sarah they were there for observation rather than negotiation. Holloway did the talking because Holloway always did the talking when there was something delicate to be managed, and this was delicate. She was a civilian now, under no obligation to cooperate, and everyone in the room understood that. She asked for 48 hours before she gave an answer. Holloway said he could give her 36. She said 48, or the answer was no. He said 48. She stood, picked up the folder, and said she'd keep it overnight to review the remaining pages. Holloway nodded. She walked out. In the corridor, she stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes on the ceiling and let herself feel the weight of what had just happened in a way she hadn't allowed herself to feel it while it was happening. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even reluctance. Exactly. It was more like the sensation of a door opening in a wall she'd spent 4 years building, not being pushed open, but opening, which was somehow worse because it meant part of her had always left it unlocked. She pushed off the wall and walked back toward the elevator. Donna was waiting near the nurse's station with the expression of someone who had been told to go home 40 minutes ago and had found a reason to stay. "Well," Donna said, "I need to brief the incoming team on caller's post-procedure monitoring," Sarah said. "He's going up to OR, but he'll be in recovery by morning, and whoever takes the ICU handoff needs to know what to watch for." Sarah, "And I need someone to pull my patient's charts for tomorrow's attending. Patricia Holt's daughter is going to have more questions, and I want to make sure whoever talks to her has the full picture." Sarah. Donna's voice had shifted. Quieter. "Are you okay?" Sarah looked at her. Donna Pruitt, who had handed her bad assignments without apology for 4 years, and told her face made things, and had stayed past her shift tonight for reasons she would never directly admit. There was something genuinely human in her expression. Right now, something that the institution they both worked for had not quite managed to train out of her. "I'm fine," Sarah said. "I just need to finish the handoff." Donna looked at her for another moment and then handed her the tablet, and that was the end of it. Sarah spent the next hour doing exactly what she'd said she would, reviewing David Coller's pre-OR notes, updating the handoff documentation for her ICU patients, checking in on Patricia Holt's daughter one final time. The woman had calmed somewhat. She'd eaten something from the vending machine. She was going to stay overnight in the family room, and Sarah made sure the night charge nurse knew that and would check on her. She drove home at 7:20. The folder was on the passenger seat. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been something industrial and had been converted in the way that things in mid-size Ohio cities got converted incompletely, affordably, with just enough aesthetic effort to charge slightly more rent than the neighborhood strictly warranted. She'd lived there for 2 years. It was quiet, which was the primary thing she'd needed, and close enough to the hospital to make the commute reasonable, and far enough from everything else that she rarely had to interact with anyone she hadn't chosen to interact with. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, opened the folder. She read all of it this time, slowly every page. The medical summary, the timeline of Volk's custody and treatment, the 3 surgical consult reports that Holloway had mentioned, all 3 of which were thorough and competent and working with incomplete information in a way that made the recommendations not wrong exactly, but misaligned in a direction that could have serious consequences if continued. She read a page that was a summary of the extraction operation, redacted in several places, and she read the redacted parts too, in the sense that she read around them, knowing enough of the original context to reconstruct what the black bars were covering. She set the folder down at 10:15 and looked at the wall. Darius Volk was not a good man. She had known that when she kept him alive in a field outside a city she wasn't supposed to be in, under orders that were both clear and something she'd chosen not to think too carefully about. He was a man with information, and information had value, and keeping him alive had been the mission. She'd done the mission. She'd done it well enough that 3 years later it had followed her to a conference room in Calverton, Ohio, and asked her to come back. Photograph in the bedside table. She'd looked at it 6 years ago, before she deployed for the last time. And she'd looked at it when she came home, and she looked at it sometimes still. Not often. Not when she was going to feel something about it that she couldn't afford to feel. She went to bed at 11. She did not look at the photograph. She was back at the hospital at 6:45 the next morning. The overnight had been quieter. The mass casualty activation had wound down around midnight, and the ER had returned to something approximating its normal operation, which meant controlled chaos rather than the other kind. David Collar had come through his surgery. She checked his post-op notes first thing, standing at the nurse's station before anyone else had acknowledged she'd arrived. And what she read confirmed what she'd suspect. The imaging had shown deeper laryngeal damage than the surface presentation had suggested, and the surgical team had addressed it successfully. And the notes included a line from the attending surgeon that said, without elaboration, that the field-level airway management had been performed at a standard that was, in her words, unusual for the presenting circumstances. Sarah noted it and moved on. She was halfway through morning checks when Ashby appeared on the ICU floor for the second day running, which was not his pattern. He typically did one walkthrough and then disappeared into the administrative and surgical layers of the hospital that were his actual domain. 2 days in a row meant something. He stopped near Bay 5 and waited until she finished her check, which was the kind of patience she hadn't seen from him before. When she turned, he said, "Can I have a few minutes?" She looked at her watch. Not to check the time. She knew the time, because it communicated that the minutes had a cost. 5, she said. They stood near the window at the end of the corridor, which gave them distance from the nurse's station, without requiring either of them to enter a room and make it feel more formal than it already was. "I pulled your service record last night," Ashby said. "Don't have clearance for that. I have a relationship with someone in hospital administration who has a relationship with a retired officer who made some calls." He said it without apology, but also without the smugness she would have expected from him a week ago. Just information offered plainly. The record is heavily redacted. But what's visible is he paused. "It's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected to find a medic who did 2 tours and got out." He looked at her. "What I found was someone who did 6 years of something that's mostly blacked out, with commendations I can't read the citations for, and a separation date that lines up with approximately when you enrolled in nursing school. And I owe you an apology." He said it directly, without the kind of scaffolding that men who weren't accustomed to apology usually built around them. She'd expect more structure, more self-justification, wearing the clothes of contrition. What she got was quieter and more uncomfortable than that, and therefore more real. "I assessed you based on your title. That was a mistake. It affected decisions I made about your role here that I don't think I can defend if I'm being honest with myself." Sarah looked at him. He was uncomfortable. He was also telling the truth, which she could distinguish from the performance of truth by now from long practice. "Potassium supplement was within scope," she said. "I know. The airway and trauma too, I know what it was." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to need time to recalibrate how I think about what you should be doing on this floor. But I'm telling you that I'm aware the recalibration is necessary." Studied him for a moment. 4 years of documented complaints. 4 years of stay in your lane, delivered with varying degrees of directness. She thought about Patricia Holt's potassium levels and the third-year resident who'd said an hour was fine, and the two trauma applications she'd submitted and watched disappear without even a formal rejection. Recalibrating is a start, she said. We can talk about what it looks like in practice when I'm back. Caught the phrasing. When you're back. I haven't decided anything yet. But if I go, I'll need proper coverage for my patients, and I'll need the handoff documented to a standard that doesn't put anyone at risk while I'm gone. Whatever you need, he said. Then, after a pause that felt genuine rather than tactical, what's in Pittsburgh? A patient who needs specific consultation, related to what happened in that conference room. Related to work I did before this hospital, Sarah said. That's all I can tell you. He nodded. He looked like he had more questions and had decided not to ask them, which was, she thought, the most mature she'd ever seen him behave. Called Holloway at noon from the hospital parking garage, standing between two parked cars in the specific privacy that enclosed spaces provided. I'll come, she said. I need 2 things. Tell me. My patients are covered by someone who actually knows what they're doing. Not a float nurse from a different floor. Someone with ICU experience who can do a proper handoff from me directly. I want to brief them myself before I leave. That's a hospital logistics issue. You can make a call. You're resourceful, Holloway. You found me 2 years ago. You can convince someone to send a qualified nurse to Calverton for a week. Pause. What's the second thing? I see Volk's full imaging before anyone walks me into a room and asks me questions I can't answer without it. I don't do the consultation blind. That's reasonable. I know it's reasonable. I'm telling you it's also non-negotiable. Understood. Another pause. Sarah. She waited. What you did yesterday, he said. Airway. Caller. You heard about that. We were in the building for 3 hours before anyone knew we were there. People talk in hallways. Something shifted in his voice, not softness exactly, but a change in register, like a frequency adjusted slightly. The team heard about it, Webb and Carver. And nothing. They just heard about it. He let that sit for a moment. Tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, there'll be a vehicle outside. She looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. Somewhere above her, the hospital was doing what hospitals did, continuous and indifferent, and her patients were being monitored by people who didn't know them the way she knew them. And Patricia Holt was probably asking a nurse who hadn't read her full chart a question that required the full chart to answer properly. Clock, she said, and hung up. Spent the rest of the day doing what she always did, working. She completed full documentation on all her patients. She had a 30-minute conversation with the ICU charge nurse about coverage protocols and a separate conversation with Marsh, who had apparently spent the night thinking about what had happened in Trauma Bay 2, because he arrived at that conversation with a list of questions that were specific and technical and actually quite good. She answered them without softening anything, and at the end of it, he said, I would have lost him, meaning caller, and she said, yes, because the truth was more useful to him than a cushion. And he nodded and walked away looking like someone who had been handed something heavy and was going to carry it. 4:30, Carol Spence found her in the medication room and told her that Ashby had authorized a full leave of absence with pay, effective the following morning, and that he had personally called the nursing director to arrange qualified ICU coverage for her patients. Sarah looked at her. He did that today? He did it at 2 o'clock, Spence said. I don't know what happened in that conference room yesterday, but I've worked with Garrett Ashby for 9 years, and I have never seen him move that fast on a staffing accommodation for a floor nurse. Sarah set down the medication she was logging. She thought about what that meant, not the gesture, but the machinery behind it. The particular effort required for a man who had spent 22 years arranging his environment to accommodate his own certainty to look at that arrangement and start mouselaces in a different direction. Make sure the coverage nurse gets the full handoff briefing, Sarah said. Not just the charts. I'll leave written notes for each patient. Of course. And make sure someone checks on the Holt family in the morning. Daughter is there overnight. She's going to have questions. I'll personally make sure of it, Spence said. Sarah looked at her. Okay, she said. She finished the medication log, filed it, and went back to her patients. She went home at 6, made food she didn't fully taste, packed a bag with the practical efficiency of someone for whom packing had once meant the difference between carrying what you needed and carrying weight that would slow you down. 3 days' worth of clothes, her medication, a notebook, the Volk folder. She set the bag by the door. She sat in the kitchen with the second cup of coffee. She wasn't going to drink and looked at the table and let herself think about what she was walking back into, not the federal facility, not the consultation itself, but the world adjacent to those things. The world where she'd spent 6 years operating under a name that wasn't Sarah Mullen, making decisions that the person she was now preferred not to examine in full detail, keeping people alive for reasons that ranged from genuinely good to genuinely complicated. She had come to Calverton to be a nurse, not a medic, not whatever she'd been in those blacked-out years. A nurse, which was both less and more than people gave it credit for, and which asked of her a different kind of strength than the other thing had asked, quieter, less visible, requiring her to absorb and persist rather than act and move on. She didn't regret it. She didn't regret this either. She just wished the two things didn't have to be the same person. At 9:15, her phone lit up on the table. Not Holloway. Not a hospital number. A number she didn't recognize, with an area code she didn't recognize, and a text message that was 4 words. Don't come to Pittsburgh. She stared at it. She typed back, "Who is this?" The message delivered. No response. She waited 3 minutes. No response. She called the number and it rang once, and then produced a sound that wasn't a disconnected tone, something else, something that meant the line had been routed through a system that didn't want to be traced. She set the phone down, picked it up, looked at the message again. Don't come to Pittsburgh. Not it's dangerous, or you're in danger, or any elaboration. Just a direction. From someone who had her number, which was not publicly available, and who had sent it at 9:15 on the night, before she was supposed to get in a federal vehicle at 6 in the morning. She looked at the bag by the door. Then she picked up the phone and called Holloway. It rang 4 times. 5. He picked up on the 6th, which meant he'd seen the number and taken a moment before answering, which meant he already knew why she was calling, or he was managing something on his end that required a moment to set aside. I got a text, she said. A pause that lasted just long enough to mean something. From what number? She read it to him. The pause this time was longer. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, still controlled. Still the operational register she recognized from years of working alongside it, but carrying something underneath that she hadn't heard from him in a very long time. Don't respond to it again, he said. I already called back. I know. Don't do it again. Holloway. Sarah, who knows I'm coming to Pittsburgh? The pause that followed was the longest one yet, and in it she heard something that the words he eventually said were designed to partially conceal. That, he said carefully, is exactly what I'm trying to figure out. She didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid. Fear was a specific physiological response. And what she felt wasn't that. Wasn't the elevated heart rate and the tunneling of attention, that she'd learned to recognize and manage in environments where fear was a relevant input. What she felt was more like a recalibration. Kind of alertness that came when a situation revealed itself to be different from what it had appeared to be. And the mind began quietly revising its assumptions about every piece of information it had received up to that point. 4 words in a text. From a number that routed to nothing. She sat at the kitchen table until midnight. Then she moved to the couch. then back to the table, because the couch implied rest, and rest implied a relaxation she wasn't going to achieve. She made a third cup of coffee she didn't drink and looked at the Volk folder and thought about what she knew and what she'd been told and where those two things didn't fully overlap. Holloway had said he was trying to figure out who knew she was coming to Pittsburgh. That was the answer of a man who was managing a problem, not a man who was surprised there was one. She'd heard enough operational language in her life to distinguish between the two. He wasn't alarmed by the text. He was concerned about the implications of it, which meant he'd already been aware there was a potential exposure in whatever chain of people knew about this consultation request. Pulled out the folder and looked at the list of individuals named in the consultation summary. 6 people at the federal facility, all listed by title rather than name, which was standard for this kind of documentation. The 3 surgical consult teams, 2 from federal medical programs, 1 civilian contractor, their institutions named but not individual physicians. And then the coordination chain, the people who had identified the need for consultation, the people who had identified her as the right person, the people who had approved the approach. That chain was not listed. She closed the folder at 12:40 and went to the bedroom and lay down without changing clothes and stared at the ceiling until 4:30, at which point she got up, showered, and made actual food eggs, toast, the mechanical normalcy of a meal that had nothing to recommend it except that it would sustain her for several hours, regardless of what those hours contained. 5:50, she picked up the bag and went downstairs. The vehicle was already there. Black, nondescript, government plates, not the federal variety, but the kind that were specifically designed to look like they weren't the federal variety, which had the effect of making them more conspicuous to anyone who knew what to look for. Carver was driving. Webb was in the passenger seat. Holloway was in the back, and he had the particular quality of someone who had also not slept, though he wore it differently than Sarah did, less visible, more controlled, packed down into the set of his jaw and the slight flatness around his eyes. Set the bag at her feet. The number, she said, before Holloway could say anything. Traced to a burner purchased in Harrisburg 8 days ago, he said. Activated once to send you that text. 8 days ago. Before you came to Calverton. Before we came to Calverton. She looked at him, which means whoever sent it knew about the consultation request. Before you showed up at my hospital. Which means the exposure isn't in your team. The exposure is upstream, Holloway said. In the coordination chain. How far upstream? We don't know yet. She looked out the window. Calverton streets at 6 in the morning were still dark in the way that November mornings in Ohio were dark, not the interesting dark of late night, but the flat, tired dark of a day that hadn't decided whether to start yet. A gas station. A stoplight cycling through its sequence for nobody. A woman walking a dog with her hands jammed in her pockets. Is Volk actually in Pittsburgh? Sarah said. A pause. Just long enough. Yes, Holloway said. But the consultation setup has been modified in light of the text. We're not going directly to the facility. There's a staging location first. We need to be certain the facility itself hasn't been compromised before we bring you inside. Sarah absorbed this. What's at stake if the facility is compromised? Volk's information pertains to a weapons procurement network operating across 4 countries. The right people know he's in medical custody and conscious enough to talk. The incentive to ensure he doesn't become conscious enough to talk is significant. And I'm walking into the middle of this. You were always in the middle of this, Holloway said quietly. You've been in the middle of it since the night you kept him alive in that field. She didn't answer that. Because it was true, and because the truth of it was one of those things she'd known, without letting herself know it, a fact. She'd filed somewhere in the back of the operational part of her mind, and left there, unlabeled. Car moved through Calverton and onto the highway, and the city fell away behind them. Staging location was a nondescript medical office building, 40 minutes outside Pittsburgh in a suburb called Grayfield, the kind of place that existed in the margins of larger cities, functional, anonymous, the architectural equivalent of a form letter. Third floor, a suite that had been cleared of its usual occupants, furnished now with portable monitoring equipment and a folding table covered with files and 2 laptops. A woman Sarah hadn't met was working at one of the laptops when they arrived. Holloway introduced her as Dr. Nora Fisk, federal medical contractor, the physician who had been managing Volk's case since his arrival in custody. Fisk was mid-40s, precise in her movements, precise with the exhausted competence of someone who had been fighting a problem for 6 weeks without enough information to solve it. She shook Sarah's hand and said, without preamble, "I need you to look at the imaging from Monday." "Show me," Sarah said. They spent 40 minutes at the table, with the imaging pulled up on the larger of the 2 laptops, and within the first 5 minutes, Sarah understood 2 things simultaneously: that Fisk was genuinely skilled, and that Fisk had been working with an incomplete picture that had led her in a direction that was medically coherent but clinically wrong for this specific patient. The lateral margin. She'd been right about that from the folder alone. What the imaging showed in high resolution, that the folder's written summary hadn't fully conveyed, was a progression of tissue response that had the specific character of chronic mechanical pressure being applied against a displaced structure. Not infection, not organic deterioration. Iatrogenic caused by the treatment, not by the original injury. "You've been managing the edema with compression protocols," Sarah said. Standard approach for this presentation. It's standard for a standard displacement. This displacement isn't standard. Sarah pointed at the image, at the specific anatomy that explained it. In the field, the vascular structure here was already partially compromised when I reached him. I had 2 choices: approach from the lateral margin and accept nerve risk or displace in this direction, and accept that anyone who treated him later without knowing that would misread the tissue geography. She paused. I made the wrong call. Not the wrong call for the field. In the field, it was correct. Wrong call for his long-term treatment. Fisk was silent for a moment. "You're saying the compression protocols have been minutes working against the displacement?" "Yes." Sarah sat back. "You need to decompress in the opposite direction. And you need to do it carefully, because the tissue at the lateral margin has been under sustained stress for 6 weeks. And it's going to behave unpredictably when you relieve the pressure." "How unpredictably?" "Bleed risk is significant. You'll need vascular on standby, and you'll want to stage the decompression over at minimum 2 sessions, rather than attempting a single procedure." She looked at Fisk. "I'll write it up. All of it. What I did in the field, the anatomy as I found it, the approach and the reasoning. Everything your surgical team needs to understand before they go back in." Fisk exhaled slowly. "How long to write it up?" 3 hours if I have access to his full chart history from intake. "I need everything your team has done since he arrived. I can have that pulled in 20 minutes, then 3 hours. Fisk nodded. He closed the laptop and went to make calls, and Sarah was left at the folding table, with Holloway standing near the window, and the particular quality of quiet that came from a problem being, if not solved, at least finally correctly identified after 6 weeks of being approached from the wrong angle. "You said you made the wrong call," Holloway said. "I made the call the field required. It created a downstream complication I didn't anticipate. You kept him alive. I kept him alive in a way that made his long-term treatment harder." She looked at the imaging still open on the screen. "That's not a clean win. It's just the least bad option that was available that night." Holloway looked at her with something she recognized from years ago, not admiration. Admiration, which would have been too simple, but the more complicated thing that came from watching someone apply an unflinching standard to their own work. "Most people would just call it a win," he said. "Most people weren't there," she said. She wrote for 3 hours and 20 minutes. The full chart history arrived as promised, and she worked through it methodically, building the written consultation document that Fisk's surgical team would need, not a narrative account, but a clinical one, technical and specific kind of document that left no room for interpretation, because interpretation was what had caused 6 weeks of pressure applied in the wrong direction. She wrote about the field conditions, the anatomy as she'd encountered it, the specific decision point, and the reasoning behind each choice. She described the displacement in terms precise enough that a surgeon who had never met her could understand the geography of what she'd done and work safely within it. Holloway brought her coffee at the 90-minute mark. She drank it without stopping. At the 2-hour mark, Webb knocked and entered, and said something to Holloway in a low voice, and Holloway's expression changed in the specific changed when information arrived that required immediate processing. "Give me a minute," Holloway said to her. "Take whatever you need. I have 40 minutes left." He and Webb went into the corridor. The door didn't close all the way, which was probably intentional on someone's part and possibly not on someone else's. She could hear the register of their voices, but not the content. Kept writing. 15 minutes later, Holloway came back alone. He sat across from her at the folding table and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read years ago as the preamble to information she wasn't going to like. "We have a problem," he said. She didn't stop writing. "Tell me, the upstream exposure. We've identified where the leak came from." He paused. "Came from the facility's internal coordination log. Someone with access to Volk's case file accessed the consultation request documentation 2 days before we came to Calverton. Pulled your surface record, cross-reference the connection between the original field treatment and your current identity." Sarah stopped writing. She looked up. "Someone inside the federal facility," she said. "Someone with Tier 2 access to case documentation. We don't have a name yet. We have an access log entry and a user credential that turns out to belong to someone whose credential should not have been active, a staff member who went on extended leave 6 weeks ago. Stolen credential. Or a credential that was deliberately kept active by someone with administrative authority over the system." Holloway's hands were still flat on the table, which means the person who accessed the records may have had help from inside the facility's administration. Sarah set down the pen. She looked at the document she'd been building for 2 hours and 20 minutes, the document that Fisk's team needed, that Volk needed, that was currently the most precise account, a specific field procedure that existed anywhere. "If the facility is compromised at the administrative level," she said, "then whoever sent me that text isn't just warning me off. They're trying to prevent the consultation from happening at all. That's our assessment, yes. Which means Volk's information is specific enough and current enough that someone is actively trying to keep him incapacitated." She paused. "Which means the timeline isn't 6 weeks of bad treatment. It's 6 weeks of treatment that was maybe being pointed in the wrong direction on purpose." Holloway's jaw tightened. "We don't have evidence of deliberate sabotage of the treatment protocols. But you're not ruling it out." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Picked the pen back up. "I need to finish the document," she said. "Whatever is happening at the facility, the surgical team needs this before they go back in. If Fisk is clean, and I think she is, or you wouldn't have brought me to a room with her, then this document gets to her, and the procedure happens, and Volk either recovers or he doesn't. Everything else is a separate problem. The separate problem involves your safety. My safety has been a separate problem before. I'm still here." She looked at him across the folding table. "Finish the debrief on the credential breach. Find me a name. And let me finish writing." He looked at her for a moment and then nodded and got up and went back to the door. "Holloway," he stopped. "When you find the name," she said, "I want to know it before anyone else acts on it. Not after." He held her gaze, then agreed. He left. She wrote. Fisk received the completed document at just past 1 in the afternoon and read it standing at the folding table. While Sarah watched her process it, the way her eyes moved through the technical sections, small nods that indicated recognition of specific clinical logic, the one moment where she stopped and went back to reread a paragraph with the focused stillness of someone reconciling new information against 6 weeks of assumptions. Stage decompression, Fisk said. 2 sessions minimum. At least 2. Depending on how the tissue responds to the initial pressure release, you may need a third. You're on standby the entire time. Not on call. In the room. Fisk looked at her. This is going to require pulling resources at the facility that will require authorization from people above my pay grade. Can you get it? Given what's in this document. Fisk set it down. Yes, I can get it. How long to set up realistically? 36 hours. I need to brief the surgical team, arrange vascular coverage, get authorization for the modified approach. She paused. Will you be available for questions during that window? The surgical lead is going to want to talk to you directly before they proceed. I'll be available, Sarah said. She meant it. She also noted, without saying it, that 36 hours was a long time to spend in a nondescript building in Grayfield with a credential breach at the target facility and an unknown number of people who were motivated to prevent the outcome that this document was designed to enable. She filed that note in the same place she filed the operational assessments she'd been making since the moment she'd gotten into the car that morning quietly, without expression, adding each piece to the picture she was building of what exactly she'd walked back into. Holloway came back at 2:15 with Webb and Carver and a fourth person she hadn't met, a woman in her 30s named Agent Solis, who introduced herself with a credential and a handshake and got immediately to the point. Credential breach, Solis said, spreading a printed access log on the table. The account belongs to a facility staff member named Warren Price. Administrative coordinator went on medical leave 6 weeks ago. His access should have been suspended on day 1 of his leave per standard protocol. It wasn't. She tapped the log. The account remained active because someone with system administrator access to the facility's medical records database manually overrode the automatic suspension. Who has system administrator access? Holloway said. 4 people. We've eliminated 2 of them. They were off-site at a conference during the window when the override occurred. 2. Solis looked at Sarah. One of them is a deputy director of facility operations named Thomas Greer. The other is the facility's chief of medical records, a woman named Patricia Winslow. Where are they now? Holloway asked. Greer reported to work this morning. Winslow called in sick. Solis paused. She called in sick the day after the text message was sent. The room processed that. Sarah looked at the access log. Timestamp on the credential access the specific date and time when someone had used Warren Price's active account to pull her file. Days ago. The same 8 days ago when the burner phone that had sent her 4 words was purchased in Harrisburg. Winslow's home address, Sarah said. We have it, Solis said. Team is... Solis's phone rang. She looked at the screen and something in her face changed, a quick tightening, the expression of someone receiving information that was moving faster than the plan for it. She stepped away from the table and answered, and the room stayed quiet. And Sarah watched Holloway watch Solis and saw in his face the specific alertness of someone who understood that the next 30 seconds were going to matter. Solis came back to the table. Winslow left her residence 2 hours ago, she said. Her car is in the lot of Calverton Regional Medical Center. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Sarah was on her feet before she was aware of having decided to stand. The operational part of her mind, the part she'd spent 4 years trying to keep in a drawer in an apartment in Ohio, was running calculations with a speed and clarity that the nursing part of her mind recognized but could not match. Calverton Regional, the hospital that had been at capacity during the Route 9 overpass emergency. The hospital 12 minutes from Hartwell Memorial. The hospital in the same city where Sarah Mullen had worked for 4 years, where her patients were, where Donna Pruitt was running the charge desk, where Patricia Holt was 2 days post a surgical and where a vent patient had an alarm history that wasn't fully documented, where Ashby had filed papers that morning authorizing a leave of absence for one specific ICU nurse. Holloway, Sarah said. I see it, he said. She's not at Calverton Regional, Sarah said. She's in Calverton. She went to Calverton because someone told her I was gone and wouldn't be back for a week, and she stopped. The thought completed itself in a direction she didn't want it to go, and she went there anyway, because not going there was a luxury that people who were still deciding how serious a situation was could afford, and she had passed that point. Ashby's administrative authorization. My leave paperwork. It was filed this morning through the hospital's system, which is accessible from web started. From any connected administrative terminal, Sarah said, including whatever system the federal facility uses to coordinate with civilian medical institutions. She was already picking up her jacket. Winslow didn't go to Calverton Regional. She went to Calverton because the leave paperwork told her exactly when I'd be gone and exactly where my patients were and exactly who wouldn't be in that building to notice what she was doing. The room understood. Solis was already on her phone. Holloway crossed to Sarah in 2 strides. We don't know that she's a direct threat. We know she's connected to a credential breach. She disappeared the day after someone warned me off, and she's now in the same city as the hospital where I work. Sarah looked at him. That's enough. Patricia Holt is 3 days post-surgical. Her electrolyte balance has been unstable. She's on a modified care protocol that only I know the full reasoning behind, and whoever is covering my patients right now received a briefing that was good but not complete because I didn't have time to make it complete. She pulled her jacket on. If someone with medical knowledge and a reason to create a problem gets access to that floor. We're calling the hospital right now, Solis said, phone already at her ear. We're alerting security. Hospital. Security is 2 retired officers and a desk check, Sarah said. Call the Calverton police and get me in a car. Now. Holloway looked at her for 1 second. 1 second of weighing protocols against reality, procedure against the specific human cost of getting this wrong. Carver, he said. Drive. They were moving before the door finished closing behind them, down the stairs and into the parking lot where the black vehicle sat exactly where they'd left it. And Carver was already starting the engine, and Sarah was in the back seat with Holloway, and the folder was still on the folding table upstairs, and none of that mattered, because 40 minutes away, a woman named Patricia Holt was sleeping in a hospital bed that Sarah had fought to protect, and somewhere in the same building, a person who had pulled Sarah's file from a federal database and helped send a warning text and driven to Calverton. On the day Sarah left, was doing something that no one had yet been close enough to stop. Solis was on the phone behind them, coordinating, relaying, and Sarah heard her say the name of the Hartwell Memorial ICU and the words potential unauthorized access, and then the words that made the back of Sarah's neck go cold. The charge nurse is reporting, Solis said, and her voice had taken on the specific, controlled flatness of someone conveying bad news in a professional setting, that there is an individual on the ICU floor who identified herself as a physician consultant from a federal medical program. She presented credentials. A pause. She's currently inside Bay 5. Bay 5. Carver pushed the vehicle to 93 on the highway stretch outside Grayfield, and nobody told him to slow down. Holloway was on one phone and Solis on another, and Sarah sat between them with her hands flat on her knees, doing the things she'd learned to do in vehicles, moving fast toward bad situations, not suppressing what she felt, but cataloging it, separating the useful responses from the ones that would cost her when she got there. Patricia Holt, 3 days post-surgical, modified electrolyte protocol. A woman who had no idea that the specific arithmetic of her care had become a pressure point in something that had nothing to do with her bowel resection, or her daughter who'd slept in the family room, or the 34-minute. Conversation she'd had with a nurse who'd made her a promise. Sarah had made her a promise. Holloway ended his call. Calverton PD is en route. ETA 12 minutes from the initial call. We're 15 out, Carver said. Hospital security has been told not to approach the individual in Bay 5. To observe and contain without confrontation until we arrive. Who told them that? Sarah said. Solis. Hospital security doesn't take operational direction from a federal agent they've never met over a phone call. Holloway looked at her. They do, when the call comes from the hospital's own administration. Spence authorized it. Carroll. Spence. Sarah filed that the administrator who had delivered Ashby's leave authorization paperwork with something that had looked like genuine care. Useful. Spence was in the building, and she was moving. What do we know about what Winslow is doing in that room? Sarah said. Solis lowered her phone. The charge nurse on the floor, Pruitt, reported that the woman identified herself as Dr. Linda Marsh, federal medical consultant, and presented a badge. Pruitt said the badge looked legitimate. She said the woman asked to review the chart of the patient in Bay 5 as part of an ongoing federal health coordination review. She used the name Marsh, Sarah said. Yes, Elliot Marsh is a third-year resident at Hartwell. She pulled that name from my file from the documentation of the Kohler procedure. Sarah looked out the window at the highway moving under them. She did her homework. She's been in the room for 11 minutes, Solis said. Pruitt is watching through the glass. She says the woman is reviewing the chart on the wall tablet and hasn't touched the patient. Yet Sarah didn't say, because saying it wouldn't make it less true and would make the next 12 minutes harder to sit through. What's Winslow's medical background? Sarah said. Solis checked her phone. Administrative coordinator by title. But her employment history, before the federal facility, she has a lapsed nursing license. Ohio. Expired 8 years ago. She knows what she's looking at in that chart. Yes. The highway became a surface road, and the surface road became the familiar grid of Calverton's east side, and Sarah felt the city around her, the way you felt a place you'd driven through 1,000 times, not consciously, just as a layer of knowledge under everything else, the turns coming before the signs. When we get there, Holloway said, you stay with me. I'm going to Bay 5. Sarah Holloway, that is my patient. She said it without heat, without volume, in the tone that communicated that the conversation was over, not because she'd won it, but because there was no conversation to have. I'm going to Bay 5. You can be next to me or behind me, but you're not going to be in front of me. He looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the road ahead and said nothing, which was the only answer she needed. Hartwell Memorial's parking lot at 2:40 in the afternoon was its usual midday configuration, 2/3 full, ambulance bay clear, the automatic doors of the main entrance cycling for a man with a walker and a woman pushing a stroller. Normal. The building had no idea what was happening on its 3rd floor, or if it did, it wasn't showing it in any way that a person arriving for the first time would notice. Sarah was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. Holloway was a step behind her. Webb and Carver fanned without being told, taking angles on the entrance and the ambulance bay in the practiced way of people who covered space by habit. She went through the main entrance and took the stairs, not because the elevator was slow, but because the stairs was a direct line, and she didn't want to stand still for 30 seconds while the floors counted up. Holloway matched her pace without comment. 3rd floor. The ICU entrance. Through the glass panel of the door, she could see the nurse's station, and Donna Pruitt standing behind it, with the posture of someone executing a very specific instruction through an act of considerable will, staying in place, not approaching, watching Bay 5 through the glass panels, with the expression of a woman who very much wanted to do something and was being professional about not doing it. Sarah pushed through the door. Donna looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise, relief, and a rapid professional recalibration in less than 2 seconds. She's still in there, Donna said, low and direct. She hasn't touched anything that I can see, but She's been on that tablet for... I see her, Sarah said. Through the Bay 5 glass, the woman standing at the wall-mounted tablet was in her mid-50s, dark hair, medical coat that fit well enough to have been obtained rather than borrowed. She had the chart open, and she was reading with the focused attention of someone who was looking for something specific. Patricia Winslow, whose name Sarah had heard 40 minutes ago in a building in Grayfield, who had called in sick the morning after a burner phone sent 4 words to a number that wasn't publicly available. Sarah walked to the Bay 5 door and pushed it open. Winslow turned. Her face did the thing that faces did when they'd been performing a role, and suddenly the performance became unnecessary, a fractional reorganization, something dropping away behind the eyes. Not panic. She was past the age of panic. It was more like a person who had been playing a hand and understood that the cards had changed. "I'm going to need you to step away from that tablet," Sarah said. Winslow looked at her, at Holloway, visible through the glass. Tablet in her hand. "I'm conducting a review on behalf of Minus. You're Patricia Winslow, administrative coordinator at a federal medical facility, currently on unauthorized leave, using a credential that should have been deactivated 6 weeks ago to access files that you then used to locate and interfere with a federal medical consultation." Sarah crossed the room and took the tablet from her hands, not forcefully, just clearly, the way you took something from someone who no longer had the right to hold it. "And you're standing in the room of my patient, so I need you to step back." Winslow stepped back, not because she was frightened, or not only because of that, but because the specific quality of Sarah's presence in that room didn't leave room for a different response. Sarah moved to Patricia Holt's bedside and ran a fast assessment vitals on the monitor. IV lines, the patient herself, who was awake and watching the exchange with the careful attention of a woman who had learned in 3 days of hospitalization that when people moved quickly around her bed, something was either very wrong or about to be resolved. "You're okay," Sarah told her. "I'm back early. Everything is fine." Patricia Holt looked at her with eyes that were tired and sharp at the same time. "The other doctor said she was checking my chart." "I know. I'm going to take it from here." Sarah checked the IV line intact. Correct. Nothing introduced. Checked the monitor readings against her memory of the protocol. Stable. The potassium was holding. Whatever Winslow had been doing with the tablet, she hadn't reached the patient. "Is anything bothering you? Any new discomfort?" "My back," Patricia Holt said. "But it's been doing that since yesterday." "I know." "That's expected. I'll adjust your positioning before I leave." Sarah straightened. Looked at Winslow, who was now standing near the door with Holloway's hand not quite touching her arm, but positioned in a way that communicated very clearly that the door was not an option. "Get her out of this room," Sarah said to Holloway, "and get someone from the Calverton PD up here. Now." "They're in the building," Holloway said. 2 minutes. Then take her to the family room and keep her there. Holloway moved Winslow out of the bay with the efficient physicality of someone for whom moving people through spaces was a practiced skill. The door swung shut. Sarah stood in the sudden relative quiet of the bay monitor beeping, ventilator cycling in the next room, the filtered hospital noise that she'd spent 4 years learning to read like weather, and let herself take one full breath before she turned back to Patricia Holt and finished what she'd promised. Scenes, Watts, scenes. Spent 8 minutes in Bay 5. She checked every line, reviewed every chart entry from the past 18 hours, adjusted the positioning pillow, as she'd said she would, and answered 3 questions from Patricia Holt with the honesty that the woman had come to expect from her. Then she stepped out and found the floor had changed in the way that floors changed when law enforcement arrived, a heightened attention in the staff. 2 uniformed officers standing at the nurse's station talking to Donna, and Carol Spence in the corridor with the expression of a hospital administrator who had authorized something unusual and was now watching its consequences arrive in her building. Solis was there too, standing near the officers, coordinating in the low voice way of someone who was being careful about jurisdiction. Sarah went to the family room. Winslow was seated at the table. Not restrained, there were no grounds for restraint yet. Technically, but with an officer positioned at the door and Holloway standing near the window, the room had the quality of something more than a conversation. Webb was in the corner running something on a tablet, and whatever he was running had been generating results because his expression had shifted in the last 10 minutes from focus to something more defined. Sarah sat across from Winslow. She looked at the woman for a moment without speaking. Winslow looked back with the particular composure of someone who had decided that their best remaining option was to say as little as possible for as long as possible, a reasonable calculation that was going to become less reasonable as the next hour proceeded. "You sent me the text," Sarah said. Winslow said nothing. "Not to protect me, to delay the consultation, to keep me out of Pittsburgh long enough." For Sarah paused, thinking it through in real time, the shape of it. For what? The procedure isn't going to happen with or without me now. Fisk has the document. She has everything she needs to brief the surgical team. Winslow's expression shifted, fractionally. Enough. "You didn't know about the document," Sarah said. "You thought if I didn't come to Pittsburgh, the consultation would stall, that Volk would stay in the coma long enough for whatever window you're working within to close." "I'm not going to discuss." "You drove to Calverton," Sarah said. "You impersonated a federal physician in an active ICU. Those are not the actions of someone with a clean conscience and a legitimate grievance. Those are the actions of someone who is running out of time and running out of options." She leaned forward slightly. "Who sent you here? Because you didn't arrange this yourself. Credential breach, the burner phone, the timing that's coordinated. Someone knew about the consultation request before Holloway's team came to my hospital. Someone with access to the procurement network that Volk's information implicates." Winslow said nothing, but her hands, flat on the table, weren't entirely still. "The people who sent you here," Sarah said, "are not going to protect you. Whatever they told you, whatever they offered you, you are sitting in a hospital family room in Calverton, Ohio, having just been caught impersonating a physician in an ICU, and the federal agents in this building are in contact with the facility where you work and where your employment records and access logs are currently being pulled." She sat back. "The question is whether you're going to be the person who helped obstruct a federal investigation or the person who provided material assistance in resolving one. That distinction matters for what happens next." Winslow looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes. Not resolution, not yet, but the beginning of a calculation that was running different numbers than the one she'd walked into this building with. "I want a lawyer," she said. "That's your right," Sarah said, and stood. Holloway. He was already moving. The next 2 hours were the kind of hours that looked like nothing from the outside, people in rooms talking, paperwork, phone calls, the slow machinery of institutional response to an event that had already happened. Sarah spent most of it on the ICU floor, doing what she would have been doing if none of the last 24 hours had occurred, because her patients needed that, and because the alternative was standing in a corridor waiting for information. She couldn't accelerate by waiting for it. She was checking the vent patient in Bay 4 when Solis found her at 4:30. "Winslow talked," Solis said. Sarah noted the vent reading, wrote it, looked up. What did she say? Enough. She was approached 4 months ago by an intermediary she knew only by a contact name. She says she doesn't know his real identity, and we're inclined to believe her because the level of compartmentalization in this network is consistent with that kind of operational structure. Solis held a printed document, a transcript summary, pages dense with text. The intermediary had information about her. Personal financial exposure. She'd made some decisions with a personal investment account that were on the wrong side of a federal boundary, and someone had documented it thoroughly enough to end her career and potentially her freedom. They leveraged her. Standard recruitment. She didn't volunteer. She was cornered. Solis paused. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, Sarah said. It doesn't. She set down the monitoring chart. What did they need from her? Initially, just access. Eyes on Volk's case. Updates on his medical status when he might regain full consciousness, what his prognosis looked like. Fed that information through a dead drop system for 6 weeks. Solis looked at the transcript. Then the consultation request appeared in the facility system. Your name cross-referenced to the field treatment. That escalated things. The intermediary told her the consultation could not happen. That if Volk recovered and talked, specific people in the procurement network would be named people who had enough resources and enough reach to make the consequences of being named very serious. For the network, for individuals within it. People who are currently operating freely. Solis folded the transcript. Winslow's been given a proffer agreement. She's going to give us everything she has on the intermediary contact method. Our technical team thinks they can trace the dead drop system. How long? Days, maybe. Weeks if the network's security is as layered as we think. Solis looked at her directly. I want to be clear that what happened here today, the speed with which we contained this is directly connected to the fact that you identified the threat and moved immediately. If Winslow had had another 20 minutes in that room. She didn't, Sarah said. No, she didn't. Sarah looked through the glass at the vent patient stable, waveform clean, the monitor doing what the monitor was supposed to do. Is Pittsburgh secure? The facility? Greer has been suspended pending investigation. 2 other staff members with Tier 2 access are being interviewed. Fisk has been moved to a secondary location to prepare the surgical briefing, and the procedure is being rescheduled at a different facility with a clean security assessment. Solis paused. Your document is intact. Everything you wrote is being used. Sarah nodded. She picked up the monitoring chart and finished the notation she'd started. Solis watched her for a moment and then said, You're going to finish your shift. I'm already here, Sarah said. Solis almost smiled. Then she went back down the corridor, and Sarah went back to work. He found her at 6. Not his usual hour for the ICU floor. Not his usual posture when he arrived. He came in without the walk-through energy, without the ambient authority that he carried through the building, like a second set of clothes. Came in the way people came in when they'd been told something that rearranged the furniture in a room they thought they knew well, and they were still finding their way around the new configuration. I've spoken with the federal agents, he said, and with Spence, and with the Calverton police. He stopped near the nurses' station, a neutral space, neither his territory nor hers. I understand what happened today more than I did an hour ago. Though I gather there are aspects of it I'm still not cleared to understand. That's probably accurate, Sarah said. The woman who came onto this floor. He said it carefully. She was here because of you, because of your history. Because people who wanted to prevent something you were involved in knew you were gone and saw an opportunity. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Patricia Holt's chart. What was she trying to do with it? Sarah had thought about this during the 2 hours she'd spent on the floor since returning. Tablet, the specific chart, the focused attention. I think she was looking for the care protocol, the modified electrolyte approach. If she could identify a dosing vulnerability something, she could adjust subtly in the chart. Notes that could adjust subtly in the chart without questioning it create a connection could create a complication that looked like a natural deterioration. She went very still. She was going to alter a patient's chart. I think that was the contingency. If she couldn't stop the consultation directly, she could create a crisis here that would pull attention back to Calverton. Pull me back here specifically. Sarah looked at him. She didn't get to it. I don't know if she would have. But I think that was the direction. The stillness in Ashby's face had the quality of a man processing something that was not about Sarah Mullen or Darius Volk or federal credential breaches. It was about the fact that a patient in his hospital on his floor had been in potential danger because of a security gap that he had not known existed, and therefore had not protected against. She could see him taking the weight of it, which was a different thing from performing responsibility. He was actually taking it. "What do you need?" he said. Question surprised her, not because it was unusual in itself, but because of who was asking it and what it had taken for him to get to a place where he asked it without the subtext of authority behind it. "Full documentation review on all my patients for the last 24 hours, she said. "I want to verify that every chart entry is clean, that nothing was accessed or modified remotely through the tablet system. I'll have IT pull the access logs for every chart on this floor tonight. You'll have them by morning." He paused. "Anything else?" "Trauma response team application. My second one. The one you declined 8 months ago." He met her eyes. "Resubmit it," he said. "It won't be declined." She held his gaze long enough to make sure the statement had the weight it needed to have. Then she nodded and went back to her patients. And he stood at the nurse's station for a moment longer before he walked back toward the elevator, without the performance he usually carried when he left a room. Donna, who had been witnessing this exchange from 3 feet away with the studied neutrality of a woman who had been in charge of a floor for 11 years and knew when to be invisible, waited until the elevator doors closed before she said, very quietly, "Did he just actually apologize?" "Close enough," Sarah said. "Close enough," Donna repeated, as if testing the weight of it. At 7:15, Holloway appeared on the ICU floor for the last time that day. He stood at the entrance and waited, which was his way of indicating he had something to say that wasn't an emergency. Sarah finished a medication check and walked over. "We're going back to Pittsburgh tomorrow," he said. "Fisk's surgical team briefing is set for noon. They want you present. I'll be there. The procedure is scheduled for the day after." Pending the briefing, he paused. "We think the network was counting on a window of at least 2 weeks. Volk conscious and talking in 5 days disrupts a significant portion of their current operational timeline." "Good. The intermediary that Winslow identified the contact method she's given us is going to take time to trace. Access log breach has already produced a lead through the facility's IT team. There's an IP routing pattern that Webb has been running since this afternoon." Holloway paused. "It traces to an address in Harrisburg, where the burner phone was purchased 8 days ago." Sarah looked at him. "You have a location." "We have a location. Solis is coordinating with the Pittsburgh field office on a site assessment. We're not moving until we're certain what we're walking into." He looked at her steadily. "This is going to resolve, Sarah. Not tonight, but it's going to resolve." She'd heard those words before, in different forms, in contexts where they'd been both true and not nearly enough. She knew the difference between a resolution and an ending, that the people who said a thing was resolved were often the people who didn't have to live inside the aftermath of it. She didn't say that to Holloway because he already knew it. "I'll be ready at 6, she said. He nodded. He started to turn. "Holloway," he stopped. "Webb," she said, "in Pittsburgh. The respiratory therapist from Trauma Bay 2 is named Marcus Webb. Coincidence?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was perfectly neutral in the specific way that perfect neutrality communicated something. "Common name," he said. "Very common," she said. He left. She stood at the ICU entrance and looked at her floor, the nurse's station, the bay panels, the monitors visible through glass, the specific quality of controlled urgency that was just the ordinary texture of an ICU doing what ICUs did. Her patients were stable. Patricia Holt's chart had not been altered. David Kohler was breathing through an airway she'd made for him and would probably be extubated within 48 hours. The vent patient in Bay 4 had a clean waveform and a family that was coming in the morning with better news than they'd had a week ago. She'd made a promise to Patricia Holt. She'd kept it. She went back to work. At 8:50 that evening, Carol Spence came to the ICU with a printed document and handed it to Sarah without preamble. "I pulled the chart access logs," she said. "All of them from the last 24 hours. Sarah took the document and read it, standing at the nurse's station. Every chart access logged by timestamp and user credential. Every tablet interaction on the floor for the past day. She read through Bay 5's log, with particular attention, the entries from the covering nurse, the overnight attending, the morning resident. And then, at 2:27 that afternoon, an access event logged to the visitor-facing tablet using a credential that belonged to a physician named Linda Marsh. A physician named Linda Marsh who did not exist. The access had lasted 9 minutes. Consistent with what Donna had reported. The actions logged: chart review, medication protocol section opened, dosing history viewed. The next logged action, which Sarah read twice before she was certain of what she was seeing, was a draft modification to the standing electrolyte protocol. Change to the potassium replacement threshold subtle, written in the clinical shorthand that only someone with medical background would recognize as a text placket, as a change rather than a standard notation. Timed at 2:34. The draft had not been saved, either because Winslow hadn't finished or because something had interrupted her. Sarah had walked through that door at 2:36. 2 minutes. She'd been 2 minutes from a chart entry that would have looked like a legitimate protocol adjustment, written in the correct clinical format, that would have directed the covering nurse to hold the potassium supplement at exactly the threshold where Patricia Holt's levels would have begun to drift. 2 minutes. She set the document down on the nurse's station. She was aware of her own breathing, of Donna watching her from 3 feet away, of the ordinary sounds of the floor continuing without pause. She was aware of the specific grinding quality of a near miss, not the clean relief of a problem avoided, but the residual weight of how close the margin had been, and what the margin had contained. "Sarah," Donna said, "log this document into the incident report file," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. "And make sure Spence gets a copy to the federal team tonight." "Not tomorrow. Tonight. Already sent," Spence said. Sarah looked at the Bay 5 glass. Patricia Holt was sleeping. The monitor was clean. The protocol was unaltered. She picked up the monitoring chart for Bay 6 and went back to work because that was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was beyond her control work, precisely until the next shift came and the floor was in order and every patient she was responsible for was as safe as she could make them. 9:40, her phone buzzed. Holloway. She stepped into the corridor to answer. "Webb finished the IP trace," he said. The quality of his voice told her before the words did that whatever he'd found was not a confirmation of what they'd expected. "The address in Harrisburg. What about it?" "It's a federal building," Holloway said. "The IP routing traces to a workstation inside the regional coordination office of a federal law enforcement agency." A pause that had a specific weight. "Sarah, someone inside that office has been monitoring Volk's case from the beginning. Someone with federal credentials and federal access. Stood in the corridor outside the ICU, with her floor behind her and Holloway's voice in her ear and the document in her hand that showed how close 2 minutes had been." "That's not a leak," she said. "No," Holloway said. "It's not. That's someone who was supposed to be on our side." A silence. "We need to talk," Holloway said, "in person." "Tonight. I'll be here," Sarah said. She lowered the phone. Down the corridor, the elevator opened, and the man who stepped out was not one of Holloway's team, and was not hospital staff, and was not a Calverton police officer. He was in a suit, mid-50s, carrying a credential wallet that he held open as he walked toward her with the unhurried pace of someone who expected to be recognized and responded to accordingly. She didn't recognize him, but she recognized the agency on the credential. The same agency whose regional office in Harrisburg had just produced the IP address that traced to the workstation of someone who had been feeding intelligence about Darius Volk. a weapons procurement network for 6 weeks. The man stopped 4 feet from her and said, "Nurse Mullen, my name is Deputy Director Alan Creed. I've been sent to take you into protective custody." He said it smoothly, with the weight of institutional authority behind every word. "There's been a threat assessment. For your safety, we need to move you now." Sarah looked at him. She looked at the credential. She thought about an IP address in a federal building, about Orc's workstation, about someone with federal credentials who had been monitoring Volk's case from the beginning. And she looked back at the man who had just told her, with the full confidence of someone who had never expected to be questioned, that he was here to keep her safe. Sarah did not move. That was the first thing, the stillness. Not the stillness of shock or hesitation, but the deliberate, practiced stillness of someone who understood that 2 seconds before a response mattered as much as the response itself. She looked at Deputy Director Alan Creed, and she looked at his credential, and she let him stand there in the corridor outside the Hartwell Memorial ICU with his unhurried authority and his smooth delivery, and she did not move toward him. "Protective custody," she said. "That's correct. There's been a threat assessment indicating that your involvement in an ongoing federal investigation has created a personal security exposure. Standard protocol in these situations." "Which office are you from?" he told her. "The Regional Coordination Office, Harrisburg." She held his gaze. "And who authorized the threat assessment?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the internal authorization chain with a civilian. What I can tell you is that time is a factor, and we need to—" "I'm going to need you to wait here," Sarah said. She turned and walked back through the ICU doors. "Creed," said Nurse Mullen. The door closed. Donna was at the nurse's station and looked up when Sarah came through. Sarah crossed to her directly, kept her voice low. "The man in the corridor. Do not let him on this floor. If he tries to enter, call the Calverton police directly, not through the hospital switchboard. Direct." Donna, who had watched Sarah walk through bad situations for 4 years, did not ask questions. "Got it," she said. Sarah went to the medication room, the one place on the floor that had a door that closed fully and no glass panel, and called Holloway. Picked up on the first ring. "There's a man in my corridor," she said. Deputy Director Alan Creed. "He says he's from the Harrisburg Regional Office, and he's here to take me into protective custody." The silence on Holloway's end lasted exactly long enough to confirm what she already knew. "Don't go with him," Holloway said. "I'm not going with him." "Where are you?" 12 minutes out. I'm in the car." She could hear the engine in the background, the particular acoustic of a vehicle moving fast. "Webb and Carver are 5 minutes behind me. Solis is already calling Pittsburgh. If Creed is who I think he is, she needs to coordinate the response through channels that don't touch the Harrisburg office." "How exposed is Solis?" "She's clean. Her authorization chain runs through a different regional office. We verified her independently before this operation started." A pause. Sarah, Creed showing up there tonight? It means something triggered him. Either the IP trace spooked someone, or Winslow made a call before she lawyered up, or someone in the building told him I was here, and still had the document, Sarah said. The document. The consultation write-up she'd sent to Fisk. The one that, if Volk recovered and talked, would form part of the evidentiary chain establishing what had been done in that field, and why the field treatment mattered to everything that came after. "He's not here to protect me." "No." 12 minutes, she said. 11 now. She hung up. Stood in the medication room for 3 seconds, not paralyzed, just placing things in order. Then she opened the door and walked back to the nurse's station and picked up the monitoring chart for Bay 5 and went to check on Patricia Holt. Because her patient was awake and her patient's chart had been targeted, and her patient did not know any of this and deserved to have her nurse present and functional. Patricia Holt was sitting up slightly, which was an improvement from the morning. She looked at Sarah with a particular assessment of a woman who had spent 3 days learning to read the maces of the people taking care of her. "Something's happening out there," she said. There's a situation being managed, Sarah said. Nothing that affects you directly. You keep coming back. The job? No. Patricia Holt shook her head slightly. Other nurses finished their shift, and I don't see them again. Keep coming back. She studied Sarah's face. What are you doing here this late? Making sure you're okay. Patricia Holt was quiet for a moment. Then, are you okay? Sarah looked at her at this woman, who was 3 days out from surgery, and dealing with a conversation about her own end of care, and had still noticed enough to ask that question, and felt something shift in her chest. Not weakness. Just the weight of the day, finding its specific place among all the other weights she carried. I'm working on it, Sarah said, and she meant it as an honest answer, which was different from the reassuring ones she'd been giving all day. Creed was still in the corridor when she came back out of the bay. He had moved to the nurse's station and was speaking to Donna in a low, authoritative voice. Donna was responding in the tone she used when she'd decided someone was not going to get what they wanted, but she was going to be professionally civil about it, which was a specific Donna Pruitt register that Sarah had learned to recognize as the sound of an immovable object performing patience. 2 Calverton police officers were at the far end of the corridor. They'd arrived quietly, no announcement, positioned in the way that Donna had probably coordinated with a phone call made while Sarah was in the bay. Creed turned when Sarah came through the door. Nurse Mullen, he said, and his voice had taken on a different quality, the smooth authority still present, but with something tighter underneath it, the register of a man who had expected this to be simpler. I understand you may have concerns. Let me be direct. The threat assessment I referenced is real, and the longer we stand in this corridor. Deputy Director Creed. Sarah stopped 6 feet from him. She said his name and title in the deliberate way that indicated she was speaking for a record, not a conversation. I am not going anywhere with you tonight. If you have legitimate authorization to conduct a protective custody action, you can present that authorization to the Calverton police officers at the end of this corridor, and they can verify it through channels that don't run through your regional office. She paused. If the authorization is legitimate, that process will take about 20 minutes, and we can have a different conversation at the end of it. If it isn't legitimate, then you and I both know exactly why you're here, and you know that I know, and I'd suggest that whatever calculation you're currently running, you factor in that there are now 3 separate law enforcement agencies aware that you walked into this hospital tonight. Creed looked at her, not with anger or not with anger alone. With something more complicated, the expression of a man who had spent a career operating in the space between official authority and its practical application, who had learned that most people, when presented with a credential and a confident posture and the language of procedure, would comply. He was recalculating. She could see it. He was running the numbers on what she just said and arriving at the same place she had. He said nothing. She held his gaze until he looked away toward the police officers at the end of the corridor, toward the elevator, toward the specific geometry of a situation that had closed around him while he'd been focused on the simple version of it. Then Holloway came through the ICU doors. He moved the way he always moved economically, without announcement, and he took in the corridor and Creed and Sarah's position in under 2 seconds. Stopped beside Sarah. He did not look at Creed the way that men who were performing authority looked at other men. He just looked at him, the way you looked at a problem you'd already solved and were confirming the solution. Alan, he said. Creed's jaw tightened. Holloway, you drove from Harrisburg. I flew. And I'm conducting a legitimate. You're going to want to stop talking, Holloway said. Not loudly. Not with any of the aggressive inflection that the sentence might have carried from a different person. Just as information, offered plainly. Solis has been on the phone with the Deputy Attorney General's office for the last 8 minutes. The authorization chain for your position in the Harrisburg office is currently being reviewed by people who aren't in your reporting chain and aren't going to be sympathetic. He paused. The IP trace from the Winslow breach. It wasn't just an access log. Webb found correspondence, encrypted, but the encryption protocol was one we've seen before. It's been used by intermediaries connected to the Volk procurement network 3 times in the past 8 months. Creed said nothing. The correspondence includes a reference to a consultation request, Holloway continued, and a reference to a specific nurse in Calverton, Ohio, dated 6 days before we came here. He looked at Creed steadily. You knew about the consultation before my team initiated it, which means you had access to Volk's case file before the formal consultation request was logged, which means your involvement, in this case, predates your official knowledge of it by at minimum 3 weeks. The corridor was very quiet. One of the Calverton officers had moved closer. Not aggressively, just repositioned, the way trained people repositioned when a situation clarified. Creed looked at Sarah, not at Holloway, at Sarah, and in his expression she saw the specific kind of recognition that came from a person understanding that the person across from them had held the line long enough for everything else to arrive. Not hatred, something colder and more honest than that. He'd built a career on being the one who held the advantages, who knew more than the person across from him, who operated in the space between visibility and consequence. And he was standing in a hospital corridor in Calverton, Ohio, at 9:50 in the evening, and the space had run out. I want my attorney, he said. That's your right, Holloway said. He nodded to the officers, and they moved, plecked, and the thing that followed was procedural and necessary and entirely without drama, which was somehow more satisfying than drama would have been. Solis arrived 20 minutes later with 2 federal agents Sarah hadn't met and a set of documents that she served to Creed's attorney, who had been called and had arrived with the speed of someone who had been on standby, told its own story in the hospital's ground floor conference room. Sarah was not present for that. She was on this ICU floor, finishing the shift she'd technically ended 3 hours ago, because that was the kind of day it had been, and because going home felt like a wrong note to end on when her patients were still here. At 11:15, Holloway came to find her in the break room where she was eating crackers from a vending machine because it was the only thing available, and she hadn't eaten a real meal since the eggs at 5:30 in the morning. He sat across from her. He didn't say anything right away. This was a thing about Holloway, professionally, that she'd forgotten in 4 years of civilian life, that he understood the value of not filling silence, of letting a moment be the shape it was before trying to name it. Creed's been in communication with the network for at least 4 months, he said eventually. Based on what Webb pulled from the encrypted correspondence, he was feeding Volk's medical updates directly to the procurement network's coordination layer, not to operators in the field above that, to the administrative structure that manages the network's financial and logistical continuity. He was protecting their timeline, Sarah said. Every week Volk stayed incapacitated was another week the network could complete transactions, move assets, close positions that would become legally vulnerable the moment Volk started talking. Holloway looked at his hands. Creed's access to the case was legitimate initially. He was part of the original coordination structure for Volk's custody. Then someone made him an offer he calculated was worth more than the career he'd already built. How far does it go? We don't know yet. Creed was a senior node, but probably not the only one. The investigation is going to be long. He paused. And complicated. And not entirely yours to carry. She looked at him. I know. I mean it. What happens next, the network, the prosecution, Volk's testimony, once he recovers, that's the machinery of institutions, doing what institutions eventually do when enough pressure is applied in the right direction. You applied the pressure. You don't have to run the machine. Sarah ate another cracker. How is Fisk? Good. She's ready. Procedure is set for the day after tomorrow at the alternate facility. The surgical team read your consultation document twice, and the lead surgeon called it. He paused, choosing words. She used the word definitive. Said it was the clearest field to clinical translation document she'd read. It's 6 years of knowledge nobody else has about a specific injury on a specific night, written in a way that makes it usable. He looked at her directly. That's not nothing. She didn't answer that. She finished the crackers and folded the wrapper and set it on the table. I need to go back to Pittsburgh tomorrow, she said. Fisk wants me at the briefing. I know. 6 o'clock. I'll be downstairs. He stood, paused. Sarah, what you did tonight, not the federal stuff, not Creed. What you did with that patient. Coming back here, staying on that floor, checking that chart, he seemed to be working towards something he didn't usually work toward in conversation. Mattered. Not to the investigation. To her. Sarah thought about Patricia Holt, asking, "Are you okay?" About the specific weight of being seen clearly by someone you'd been trying to protect. I know, she said. Darius Volk's procedure happened 31 hours later at a federal medical facility outside Philadelphia that Solis's team had vetted from its security architecture outward. The surgical team, 4 people, vascular on standby as Sarah had specified, Fisk managing the coordination, worked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Sarah was present in the observation area for the first 2 hours, and then stepped out because she'd done her part, and watching the execution of someone else's work was not something she could sustain without her hands wanting to be involved. Stage decompression worked. Not cleanly. There was a bleed event at the end of the first session that required the vascular team, and an additional 40 minutes of work, and a recalibration of the approach for the second session. But it worked. The tissue responded the way she'd predicted it would respond when the chronic pressure was relieved, and the surgical team managed the response the way the consultation document had said they'd need to manage it. And at the end of it, Volk was in a medically stable state that the treating team described as the best they'd seen since his initial custody. 3 days later, he was conscious. Sarah was back in Calverton, by then, on her floor, doing what she did. Holloway called to tell her, and she stood in the medication room again. It had become her place for calls that required privacy, and listened, and said very little, and then said, "Thank you for letting me know," and went back to work. The investigation that followed was long, and not something Sarah participated in directly, because she was a witness and a civilian, and the machine that Holloway had described took over the way those machines did, imperfect, slow, grinding, but moving. Creed was formally arrested and charged on a Tuesday morning, and the Calverton Gazette ran a brief story about a federal official taken into custody in connection with a corruption investigation, and the story didn't name the hospital or Sarah Mullen or anything that would have meant something to anyone reading it who didn't already know. That was fine. She had not needed the story. What happened at Hartwell Memorial was different. Ashby called a staff meeting on the Thursday of the following week. Not a routine meeting the kind with advance notice and a specific agenda, which at Hartwell typically indicated something administrative and dull. Sarah arrived expecting to hear about a policy change or a budget update or some other institutional reality that required 30 minutes of everyone's time. What she heard instead was Ashby standing at the front of a conference room, with most of the ICUs and surgical staff present, and saying, without theatrical preamble, that he needed to formally acknowledge something he had handled incorrectly. He was specific. He named the trauma response team applications. He named the documented complaints. He named the morning he'd called Sarah into his office and told her to remember her role. He was not performing contrition she'd seen performed contrition, and this wasn't it. He was doing the harder thing, which was accounting a series of decisions for witness of decisions in front of the people who had witnessed their effects, without softening the language into something easier to say. I allowed my assumptions about professional hierarchy to override my clinical judgment, he said. And my clinical judgment about what happened during the Route 9 response should have been immediate and unambiguous. He paused. It wasn't. That's on me. The room was quiet in the way that rooms got quiet when something happened that people hadn't expected and didn't have a ready response for. Elliot Marsh, who was seated 2 chairs from Sarah, was looking at his hands. Donna Pruitt was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had waited a long time to be in a room where a specific thing was being said. Sarah looked at Ashby, who was not comfortable and was doing it anyway, which she had come to understand was the most honest version of him she'd ever seen. It didn't undo 4 years. It didn't restore the cases she'd been excluded from, or the applications that had gone nowhere, or the specific tax of being the person everyone relied on and no one acknowledged. It was a beginning, not an erasure. She'd learned to distinguish between the two. After the meeting, Marsh found her in the corridor. He looked like he'd been thinking about what he wanted to say for several days and still hadn't settled on it. Mun one sessets. Potassium supplement, he said. When you paged me and I told you an hour was fine. I remember. I've been thinking about that. He paused. I was wrong. Not technically wrong in terms of protocol. Wrong about what the situation required. He looked at her. How did you know her levels weren't going to hold for an hour? She thought about how to answer that. About 6 years of reading situations and conditions where being wrong had an irreversible consequence, and how that kind of reading became instinct, and how instinct that specific didn't announce itself as anything other than a feeling you'd learned to trust, 'cause not trusting it had cost you before. Pattern recognition, she said, and a lot of practice. Can that be taught? She looked at him. He was asking genuinely, this third-year resident who had frozen at the foot of a bed and watched her do what he couldn't and then come back with good questions. He was imperfect, and he knew it, and he was trying to get less so. Some of it, she said. The rest you have to earn. He nodded, accepting that, and went back to rounds. The trauma response team application that Sarah resubmitted on a Monday morning was approved by Friday afternoon. Not with conditions, not with a provisional period or a supervision requirement, or any of the other institutional hedges that organizations used when they wanted to say yes, while maintaining the appearance of caution. It was approved with a note from Ashby that said, in the administrative language of hospital documentation, that the applicants demonstrated competency across both emergency and clinical settings represented an exceptional resource for the team's operational capacity. She read it once and filed it and went back to Bay 5. Tricia Holt had been moved to a regular room, by then a milestone that Sarah had monitored and that had gone smoothly, the electrolyte balance stable, the post-surgical recovery on track. She stopped in on her the afternoon of the transfer, just for a few minutes, to confirm the handoff was clean and the room assignment made sense, and the new team had the full picture. Patricia Holt was sitting up in bed eating a meal that she described as aggressively mediocre, which was a good sign. You look different, Patricia Holt said. Probably tired, Sarah said. Not tired. Different. She studied her. Like something got resolved. Sarah checked the IV site, which was clean, and looked at the monitor, which was fine, and set down the chart. How's the pain? Manageable, which is the most honest answer I've given anyone about pain in 30 years. Patricia Holt set down her fork. You're not going to tell me what happened, are you? Whatever was happening that week. No, that's fair. She was quiet for a moment. My daughter wants to write the hospital a letter. About you specifically. She doesn't have to do that. I know she doesn't have to. She wants to. Patricia Holt looked at her with the clear-eyed directness of a woman who had spent the past week confronting the fact of her own mortality and come through it with her perceptions sharpened rather than dulled. You made a promise and you kept it. In my experience, that's rarer than it should be. Sarah thought about what it had cost to keep it. The drive back from Grayfield. The 2 minutes in Bay 5 that could have gone differently. The specific weight of choosing, when given the option to be somewhere safer, to be here instead. It's the job, she said. No, Patricia Holt said, the same way she'd said it before. Other people have the same job. You're something else. Sarah didn't have an answer. For that, she wasn't sure she needed one. 3 weeks after Creed's arrest, Holloway came back to Calverton. Not with a federal vehicle or a team or an agenda. He came alone in a car with regular plates, and he called ahead, which was new. And she met him for coffee in a diner 2 blocks from the hospital because neutral ground suited both of them. He told her that the investigation had expanded, that the IP trace had identified additional 2 nodes in the coordination network, one of which was overseas and one of which was domestic, and both of which were now the subject of active proceedings. That Volk had given 3 depositions from a secure location, and that the information had been, in the assessment of the people receiving it, exactly as significant as the network had feared. That Winslow had received a reduced charge in exchange for her cooperation and would serve time but not the maximum, and that the distinction between being coerced and being complicit had been weighed and had mattered. He told her that the lead surgeon on Volk's procedure had included Sarah's consultation document as an exhibit in a case study she was writing for a federal medical journal, anonymized but detailed. The kind of documentation that would change how field-to-clinical translation was approached for custody cases going forward. Sarah drank her coffee and listened to all of it and felt the specific quality of something completing, not ending, because none of this had a clean ending, but completing. The particular sensation of a chain of events reaching its natural length. The team wants to know, Holloway said, if you'd be willing to consult again. Not operational, clinical, formally contracted, properly compensated, on a case-by-case basis. We have field medics who do exceptional work in conditions that create exactly the kind of downstream complication you described with Volk. The gap between what they do and what civilian medical teams can manage afterward is real, and it's costing people. She looked at him across the diner table. You want me to be the bridge. You're already the bridge. I'm asking if you want to do it officially. She thought about the consultation document she'd written at the folding table in Grayfield. About 3 hours and 20 minutes of translating 6 years of field knowledge into something a surgical team could use. About the lead surgeon calling it definitive. She thought about what Holloway had said in this diner, and she thought about what she was going back to. After this coffee, her floor, her patients, the trauma response team she'd just been approved for, the third-year resident who was asking better questions every week, the charge nurse who had stayed past her shift on a Tuesday night because she'd understood that something was happening that mattered. 2 things, not one or the other. Both. Send me the contract, she said. Holloway nodded. He didn't smile. He wasn't a man who smiled easily, but something in his expressions settled, the way things settled when they arrived where they were supposed to be. One more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket and set a folded document on the table. Pushed it across. She unfolded it. It was a formal commendation from the Federal Coordination Office, not Creed's office, a different one addressed to Sarah Mullen by name, citing her role in the containment of the Hartwell breach and the completion of the Volk consultation under adverse conditions. Signed by people with enough authority that the signature lines meant something. She read it, folded it back, set it on the table. I don't need this, she said. I know you don't need it, Holloway said. That's not why I brought it. She looked at him. I brought it, he said, because you spent 6 years doing things that couldn't be acknowledged, and then 4 years being told you weren't enough in a building where you were quietly the best person in the room. And I thought you should have at least one piece of paper that said, clearly, in language that couldn't be hedged or walked back or declined, without a formal process, we see you. We know what you did. It mattered. Sarah looked at the folded document on the diner table. Outside, Calverton was doing what mid-size Ohio cities did in early winter, going gray and functional, people moving between buildings, traffic cycling, the ordinary machinery of a place that didn't know and didn't need to know what had happened inside one of its hospitals over the past several weeks. Picked up the document and put it in her jacket pocket. Not because she needed the validation. She stopped needing it somewhere between the medication room and Bay 5 and the corridor where a man with federal credentials had expected her to comply and found that she didn't. She'd stopped needing someone else to tell to her. She was enough somewhere in the long quiet of doing the work anyway, when no one was watching and no one was going to say so. She put it in her pocket because Holloway had driven to Calverton to hand it to her in person, and that meant something separate from the document itself. Because acknowledgement, even when you didn't need it, was a different thing than indifference. And she'd been indifferenced at for long enough to know the difference. She was back on the floor by noon. Bay 5 had a new patient, an overnight admission. 67. Post-cardiac event. Stable, but requiring close monitoring. She read the chart standing at the nurse's station, building the picture the way she always did. Labs, timeline, medication history, specific patterns that other people's notes described, without quite naming. She made 2 notations, paged the covering resident, and went in to introduce herself. The man in the bed was awake and unhappy about being in the hospital, which was a reasonable position. He had the quality of someone who had spent a long time in charge of his own environment and found the loss of that control more distressing than the medical event that had caused it. "Are you my nurse?" he said, with the tone of a man about to outline his requirements. "I am," Sarah said. "I have questions." "I'm sure you do." She pulled up his chart on the tablet. "Let's start with what you already know and go from there." He looked at her, the specific assessing look that patients gave when they were trying to determine whether the person in front of them was going to manage them or actually help them. She'd been looked at that way thousands of times. She knew what it felt like when the assessment landed correctly. He exhaled. "Okay," he said, and started talking. She listened. She did what she'd always done, paid attention without performance. Asked the question that followed from the last answer, treated the person in the bed like someone whose understanding of their own situation mattered. It wasn't complicated. It had never been complicated. Complicated part was all the machinery that hospitals built around it, the hierarchies and the scopes and the documented complaints in the ceiling. Someone else decided was there to protect everyone. The ceiling was still there. It would always be partially there because institutions moved slowly and human nature moved even slower, and the Ashbys of the world were not transformed by a single event, however clarifying. But ceilings, she'd learned, were negotiated structures. They moved when you pushed against them with enough consistency, enough precision, enough of the particular stubborn patience that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and refusing to pretend otherwise. She had done that. She was still doing it. She would go on doing it on this floor and in federal briefing rooms and wherever the work required her to be, because that was the thing she'd understood about herself. In 6 years of field conditions and 4 years of an ICU in Calverton, Ohio, she didn't do this because someone told her to. She didn't do it for the commendation in her pocket, or the application approval on her desk, or the apology delivered in a staff meeting. She did it because when she looked at a patient who needed something that she knew how to give, the only response that made any sense to her was to give it. Everything else, the title, the recognition, the file, Ashby had been building and had stopped building, was noise around that signal. Important noise sometimes. Costly noise often, but noise. The signal was the patient in the bed. It had always been the patient in the bed. She finished the introduction, answered the man's questions with the directness he turned out to prefer once he understood it was available, and stepped out of the bay to check on the rest of her floor. The monitor showed stable vitals. The vent patient in Bay 4 was trending toward extubation. The nurse's station was managed, and the chart access logs were clean, and Donna Pruitt was at the desk, doing what Donna Pruitt did, was hold the floor together by the force of her attention and her refusal to be impressed by anything that didn't deserve it. "Normal morning," Donna said without looking up. "Good," Sarah said. Boring, even. Even better. She picked up the next chart. The work continued. The floor breathed around her monitors and footsteps and the occasional louder moment, and then the settling back into rhythm. The ordinary texture of a place where people came when they were at their most vulnerable and needed someone to hold the line between where they were and where they might not come back from. She held it. She had always held it. The difference now was that everyone in the building knew it. That was enough. Not everything. It was never everything. And anyone who told you recognition erased what came before it was selling you a cleaner story than the one that was actually true. The 4 years were still 4 years. The declined applications were still declined. The weight of being competent and invisible in the same institution was a real weight, and carrying it had cost something that getting a commendation didn't fully refund. But the person who had carried it was still here, still working, still choosing every shift to be the person who stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. Not because she needed the room to see her do it, not because she needed the credential or the title or the apology, but because when the door came open and someone needed what she had, the only thing she'd ever known how to do was walk through it. That was not nothing. That was not small. That was, in every way that mattered, everything.